Well, thanks. I am a labor economist. I'm going to sort of switch gears a little bit and talk about technology, innovation, and impacts on the labor market. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about winners and losers in the context of sort of the long sweep of technological innovation in the United States, how technologies are affecting new firm entry, the pace and dynamism of the U.S. labor market, and what some of the clouds are on the horizon. I'd like to thank Kevin Mayer for nominating me for this task. To begin with, if you look at the current labor market, it's really hard to say that this isn't about as strong a labor market as we can have in the United States. The long-run average unemployment rate in the U.S. is between 5.5% and 6%. We're currently under 4% for the unemployment rate. And if you look at places like Iowa has a 2.4% unemployment rate. There's three other states along with Iowa, North Dakota, Vermont, and New Hampshire, that are tied for the lowest unemployment rates in the country. And if you look at the more rural states, among them South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Nebraska are among the 10 lowest unemployment rates in the country. And you say, well, that looks phenomenally strong. And in some ways it is. And if you look at the current expansion, we've now had over 100 straight months of positive growth in jobs in the United States, which is the longest expansion that we've ever had. The previous longest expansion we had was in the 1990s. And so other than a hiccup in 2007 through 2009, you'd have to say that, we've just gone through over a generation of relatively strong economic performance. On the other hand, there's some things that aren't looking as positive, and one of those is how much people are paid per hour. So the growth of compensation per hour in the United States is only 9% since 2004 in real terms. So we're not adding purchasing power, and what drives wages in the United States is labor productivity. And so one of the concerns here is that we just haven't had the same growth in productivity that we've had over the long sweep of history. If you look at the 150 years before this century, productivity growth in the U.S. averaged about 2% a year, and we've been around 1% per year since then, and that's why we have sort of relatively slow growth in productivity. So this is what the post-war period looks like. The average worker in the United States produces 5 times more per hour than they produced coming out of World War II. And the average real earnings are roughly 4 times what they were in that period of time. So what drives wages in the United States is how much we can produce per hour, and that's sort of why we're a little bit worried then about relatively slow productivity growth. And if you look at the source of comparative advantage in the United States, the fact that productivity in the U.S., productivity growth in the U.S. has been stronger than productivity and growth in Europe is one of the reasons why the U.S. economy has performed relatively better than the European economies or the Japanese economies. And so if, in fact, this slowdown in productivity is now the rule and rather not the exception, then I think going forward we're going to have some concerns as to whether or not, for example, you can sustain the same level of growth in governmental services and things along those lines, because how much you can sustain when the overall economy is growing at 1% per year is different than the amount that you can sustain if you're growing at 2 or 3%. Not all of the technological innovations that have occurred have been shared equally. And in particular, if you look at the period of time since 1980, this has been an economy that favors the most skilled. And so if you look at the earnings for college graduates relative to high school graduates, the premium is now double what it was in 1980. If you look at the premium for graduate education relative to high school degrees, it's now triple what it was in 1980. So you have that the college graduates are very much benefiting from the technological innovations of the last 30 or 40 years. If you look at rising earnings inequality in the United States, about 60% of rising earnings inequality in the United States is directly attributable to rising returns to schooling. About 20% is related to the fact that college graduates also marry other college graduates, and so two-earner college graduate couples earn on average $58,000 more per year than two-earner high school graduate couples. So that's an example of how this is how important this rising returns to education has occurred. One of the common things about technologies in developing countries is that as incomes have risen, the demand for luxury goods, like the service sector, educational services, financial services, health services, grows more rapidly than income, and the demand for necessities, like agricultural commodities or manufactured products, grows more slowly. And so what happens is the entire economy shifts toward the production of services. So in the United States, 70% of our economy, in terms of labor market allocations, are in the service sector, and agriculture is now about 3% of labor services, and that's common across all the developed countries in the world. And so technologies also shift what types of things people do. It doesn't mean we produce fewer agricultural commodities. It's that they're produced by very few people. Poultry egg processing plant, the one thing you didn't see in that thing was a person, right? I mean, those chickens were on their own. They're very well trained. It's amazing how they didn't seem to be fighting one another. I mean, you put that many people in one of those places and the eggs would be flying. Okay, so just as an example, if you look at computer systems design, so agriculture is one of the fastest growing technological centers of the U.S. economy. Computers is another. Over this period of time since the mid-'80s, we've increased the hours allocated to computer design fivefold, and we've reduced the number of total hours allocated to agricultural production. The one I like is publishing, except for the internet, versus internet publishing, and so we now allocate more hours to publishing on the internet and fewer hours publishing off the internet. If you see the Des Moines Register this morning, it's like 3 pages of material, and that all came from USA Today or something like that. And so technologies aren't going to be uniform in terms of their implications for the labor market. But just to make sure, if you look at, let's see if I can get this pointer to work, this is the average productivity growth in the post-war period, and our current level of productivity growth is half what it was over that long sweep of history, where we increased wages in the U.S. fourfold since 1948. So if we're now going to grow our productivity at half that rate, that's going to have implications for how much we're going to earn in the future and how much our children are going to earn in the future. But it's also going to affect whether or not the U.S. is going to maintain its comparative advantage in technological innovation worldwide. So the question is, why are we doing that? And one of the things I want to talk a little bit about is flexibility of our labor market. So we have become noticeably less flexible in our ability to reallocate labor from one part of the country to another, to one sector to another, to one level of or type of production to another, from one firm to another. One of the sources of productivity growth in the U.S. has been that firms that are relatively less productive go away, and firms that are more productive come into an existence. And that churning process is responsible for about a quarter of our productivity growth in the post-war period. And that churning process has slowed down considerably over this last period of time. A second source of our productivity growth is technological innovation, and there are some clouds in the horizon, particularly in terms of basic research and whether or not we're going to be able to maintain our superiority in terms of innovating relative to other parts of the world. And a third thing is whether or not we're an educational leader, and there are reasons to believe that we're no longer in the position of prominence that we once were. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. One of the interesting things about the U.S. labor market is when people first go on the labor market, they have a period of what's called job shopping. The average worker in the U.S. will work on 12 different jobs between the ages of 18 and 50, and they will work on 6 different jobs in the first few years that they leave high school or college. And that has slowed down. One of the reasons that slowed down is we're less mobile. So if you look at the fraction of the population that moves either within a county or across counties, that has declined precipitously. And it's not a recent phenomenon, although it really slowed down during this last recession. One of the things that people used to do is if you lose your job and there are no jobs in your current location, you move to another location. Now people just dropped out of the labor market. So one of the reasons that you had the reduction in the unemployment rates is not because more people are employed. The fraction of people of working age who are employed has not recovered in this recession, even though the unemployment rates are historically low. Some people simply dropped out of the labor market, and there's a question as to why that happened. But it's certainly going to affect the productivity if people are not moving to the places where firms are starved for employment, where they want to hire people, and people are not moving to those jobs. A second is that the pace of churning in the labor market has declined. So if you look at job destruction and job creation, what the long pattern has been is about a third of the jobs in the U.S. disappear once and for all within a one-year period, and even more jobs are created in that period of time, and so people are moving from less productive to more productive jobs, and that's declined. This is not in one sector, this is across all sectors, so the pattern of this job reallocation across firms, across industries has declined, and that decline has been a long-term process. Young people are more likely to reallocate, but they're less likely to reallocate than they were in the past. The more educated are the least likely to reallocate because they tend to be in more stable jobs. But one of the ways that less educated people in the U.S. were able to gain was to move from one job to another, and that pace has declined. And this is not a one-state or two-state phenomenon. The pace of job reallocation has declined in every state of the United States, and it's declined more in the recent period than it did before. So if high labor productivity high labor reallocation, this flexibility, is a feature of the U.S. economy. It's one of the reasons why we have lower unemployment rates than in Europe. It's one of the reasons why we had 3% growth last year when Europe was just a little bit north of 1%. If that's declining, then that's a potential concern about whether or not we'll be able to reallocate resources from slower growing to more promising sectors of the U.S. economy. And that's going to be an issue in terms of future productivity and wage growth in the U.S. A second thing is that most firms die. You always have to have new firm entry because it's very hard to make a firm live. 1/3 of the firms in the U.S., 1/3 of the startups die within 2 years of startup. 2/3 die within 6 years of startup. And this has been the pattern for a very long period of time. So you constantly have to have new firm entry in order to maintain the labor market. If you look back to the largest firms in the world in 1912, only 7 of them are still among the largest firms today, and most of those firms no longer exist. If you look at the largest firms in the world, most of them did not exist even 40 years ago. And so you constantly have to be bringing in new ideas, new innovations, new firms to be fueling the demand for labor. And the pace of new firm entry in the U.S. economy has declined. The other thing is that where you see the most firm entry is in metropolitan areas. This is all the other counties in the United States, and you'll notice that the pace of new firm entry has been dominant in metropolitan areas relative to all the other areas of the U.S. The declining pace of new firm entry means that new firms, young firms, are no longer as important in terms of fueling labor demand in the United States as what was true in the past. So as recently as 2000, about 4.5 million jobs were created in firms that were startups. We're now down to about 2.5 million of those jobs being created in firms that are new startups. New startups, productive centers that are hiring lots of people. That's one of the ways that we were able to move people to new sectors, more productive sectors of the economy. Because of the decline of the pace of new firm entry, we now have a decline in that job reallocation process. And so the share of total employment in young firms has declined, and it's been declining steadily over the course of the last 20 years. One of the interesting things is that strong markets have not just a high rate of new firm entry, they also have high rates of firm exits. And one of the reasons is that it's easier to sell your firm if you're in a place where there's a lot of expansion. So if the operation isn't as strong as you would like, somebody else is in the wings waiting to take over that process or that space and use that. That happens in all these economies. So in smaller cities, smaller communities, where the pace of new firm entry is less, they also have fewer rates of firm deaths. But one of the things that's happened in this period of the last 20 years is that there's stronger firm entry than firm exits in the metropolitan areas, and there are more deaths than firm entry in the smaller areas. And so on net, we have a decline in the number of firms in the smaller towns and an increase in the number of firms in the metropolitan areas. And as a consequence, the weight of employment is shifting more toward the metropolitan areas or the large urban areas of over 50,000 or more. None of the other counties on average have replaced the level of employment that they had at the start of the century. And so generally what you find is a shift in the weight of labor demand toward metropolitan areas and larger urban areas and away from smaller towns. You also have then a premium that's paid for people who are employed in the metropolitan areas. So here in Iowa, if you look at average wages in the urban areas, they dominate average wages in the non-metro areas by about 14%. And that's also reflecting that shift in relative labor demand. I'm going to switch a little bit to innovation, and then I'll come back. The U.S. Invests about a quarter of all the world's investments in research and development. And what you have here is a slide that shows the fraction of the population per million in STEM fields. And what you have here is the fraction of GDP that's allocated toward research and development. And the U.S. looks relatively strong. 10 years ago, we were spending a third of all the research and development in the world, so our share of all research and development has gone down. It's not that we're spending less, it's that some of the other places in the world, in particular China, are dramatically increasing the amount that they're spending on research and development. If you look at the share of research and development on basic research, that has declined precipitously in the U.S. The federal government that used to spend 70% or be responsible for 70% of basic research is now down to 44%, and in recent years they've actually shrunk the amount that's spent on basic research. The weight of research and development in the United States, 2/3 of it is in industry, but it tends to be applied research. If basic research is the public good, that's what the public should be investing in, and the U.S. has cut down on that. And one of the reasons we've cut down on that is how much of the weight of the federal budget is now allocated toward mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the debt. So as that's taking a larger fraction of the overall federal budget, the amount that's available for discretionary things like research and development is declining, and that's not likely to change. So that's another cloud on the horizon for research and development. If you look at where it is that we're likely to have the most impactful new innovations, they're going to be things that are in the science areas and the engineering areas and in the health science areas, and a disproportionate share of this activity, this innovation activity, has been fueled by foreign-born residents of the United States. And some of that is done by being able to bring in people from all around the world into the United States in order to engage in research at our colleges and universities. If you look at high-tech firms in the United States, immigrants disproportionately have entered those areas. They're about 25% more likely to be engaged in high-tech businesses, and foreign-born leaders of those businesses atypically invest in research and development compared to native-born leaders of those industries. And so you have to worry a little bit about whether or not we're going to maintain our leadership in the world in terms of accessing the best and brightest from all over the world. We have a tremendous advantage in terms of the U.S., and the U.S. atypically, relative to other places, brings in more foreign students into the United States. But for the last 3 years now, we've had steady decreases in the number of graduate students and the number of undergraduate students in the United States who are from other places. And Australia, China, and Europe are increasing their share of the global competition, if you will, for the best and the brightest minds. If you look at H-1B visas, it's easier to sponsor H-1B visas if you're a large firm. If you're a small firm, it's very difficult. You don't have the same advantages that you have by spreading your costs across a larger number of potential H-1B visas. And so what you find is that places in the Midwest, for example, don't have a whole lot of H-1B visas. They tend to be concentrated on the coast, and they tend to be concentrated among very large firms. You are exempt from the H-1B visa limitations if you're a university or if you're a nonprofit research organization that's related to a university. But cutbacks in funding have basically made it more difficult then to bring in people into those those areas, and so there's some concern that we are not going to be able to have the same pace of innovation that we've had in the past. One of the things that the 20th century was viewed as the American century, and the 20th century was also the human capital century. And it was a period of time where the U.S. went from most people not having a high school degree to about a third of the population now having a college degree. But our rate of increase of school attainment sort of dropped with the birth cohort of 1950, and it's flattened out since then. And so in terms of the U.S. advantage that we had through most of the 20th century in terms of the educated workforce, that advantage has basically disappeared. And then if you look at the performance of our students relative to other places, we now perform below the OECD average, the industrialized economy average, in terms of the performance of our kids in math. So if one of the things that's a source of our advantage is STEM fields, then you have to say, okay, we're not bringing in as many people from other places, and we're also not growing it naturally in terms of our own kids. That's going to be an issue, I think, in terms of where things go. So what does this mean for farm incomes? What does it mean for rural areas in the United States? One of the things that we developed recently is this, well, I like this. I mean, why not? I mean, I'm a geek. So plot out the distribution of farms by their market shares. So what you have on the horizontal axis is farm size, and what you have on the vertical axis is the accumulated market share of these places, and then you can sort of map out what's true about the distribution of farm sizes. So if you look at the median here, and you go across to wherever you are on that line, that's going to tell you what the median farm size is on the basis of accumulated market share. So in 1959, which was the earliest we could get this type of data, the weighted farm size was roughly 250 acres. And if you look at technologies in the production of corn, not surprisingly, what you find is that large farms are becoming more and more important. So you now have that the median farm size is going to be roughly 1,300 acres based on the share of the overall market that's controlled by relatively large farms. And you can see visually the progression from smaller, from a market dominated by small farms to a market dominated by large farms. If it was 100% dominated by very large farms, this line would be just perfectly flat and then go up, right? So you would have 100% of the market being controlled by those very large farms. But that's not true of all commodities. So if you look at fruits, trees, and nuts, you actually have that there's been a shrinking of the average farm size. And the reason is that if you look at the education levels, the role of education on farm size measured by this pattern, you have that as education increases, the average size of farm actually goes down. And the reason is that people are more likely to work off the farm the more educated they are. And what you find is that over time, the most educated farmers are ones who are spending more of their time off the farm with relatively smaller operations, and it's the very large operations that don't have someone who's going to be working off the farm. And so about 80% of farm household income now comes from off-farm sources, and that changes how you think about how agriculture is likely to occur. If you live in close proximity to an urban market, that's where the rewards are for education, right? That's where you have the growth and new innovation in terms of more firm development, and that's where the wages are relatively higher. And so you're likely to find a lot more relatively small farms in proximity to metropolitan areas, and the very larger farms are going to be in more isolated areas where those towns are getting smaller and smaller and smaller because they can't access those urban markets. And so this is sort of the last slide I want to make that point. If you look, this is just Iowa data, and if you look at counties with fewer than 4,000 jobs, 41% of the people with jobs in that county do not work in that county. They're commuting to another county in order to find their work. And where they're commuting to is places like Ames, Des Moines, Iowa City, Cedar Falls, Cedar Rapids, where they can get a reward of 14 to 20% higher wages in reward for that added commuting time. Iowa is more rural than Nebraska. And you don't think of it that way, but most of Nebraska is empty. And the reason most of Nebraska is empty is because most of their job centers were on the eastern side where you had relatively large towns. And if you could not access those bigger markets and you lived in a rural area, you had to move. So I started off this by talking about one of the sources of reduced dynamism in the U.S. is people are not moving as much. Where the people in the U.S. are moving, and one of the sources of dynamism in the U.S. economy is the increasing mobility of people on a daily basis who move from smaller towns to the cities. They can access the higher wages in the cities and benefit from the lower cost of living in the smaller towns. And that's what's happening in Iowa. And that's why we have so many small towns that still survive in Iowa when most of them have died in Nebraska. And that's because they're now accessing this large share of their incomes from metropolitan areas, from the metropolitan markets that are broadly dispersed across the state. And that's what I got. Thanks.